The theme of this year's forum is getting to and moving beyond 2025. And where we're coming from in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, one commitment that we've made is to plant 95,000 acres of a new riparian buffer from a 2010 baseline in that time. By riparian buffer, we just mean trees or grasses that are planted next to a stream to capture extra nutrients rather than let them enter the streams. If we assume that the average buffer width in the Chesapeake Bay is about 100 feet wide, then ideal steady progress might look something like this graph. But progress has not been so ideal, and if we continue planting at our current rates, then we might only hit half of our 2025 target. This leads us to a pressing question of how do we bridge the gap in riparian buffer adoption? Well, in order to bridge the gap, we need to understand it. And what many people working in these watersheds understand is that this gap doesn't exist for lack of trying, but because we can't do everything everywhere. Limitations of funds and boots on the ground mean that we prioritize where we plant buffers and where we even engage landowners in outreach towards buffer adoption. Generally, this prioritization has been based on purely biophysical or ecological need. Like, for example, if a stream is not attaining its use for supporting trout or other aquatic life. These are some recent examples here from traditional windshield surveys, from model outputs, or from the Chesapeake Conservancy's own precision conservation mapping. But what if instead of only mapping where buffers are physically needed, we also mapped where they were wanted? A growing body of literature highlights this need to integrate sociodemographic and biophysical data to increase engagement with riparian buffer outreach, hopefully towards adoption. One particular study of interest is from Alexander Metcalf and others, who purchased consumer data to develop a model that sorts all riparian landowners in this red study area into two groups that were either more or less likely to engage with riparian outreach based on sociodemographic or consumer indicators like age, education, spending habits. And after testing this model through surveys, they found that a micro-targeted group was actually 66% more likely to engage with a riparian restoration effort than the control group. This proof of concept motivated us to try a similar approach using freely available sociodemographic data in Center County, Pennsylvania. So overall, our goal was to bridge this gap in riparian buffer adoption by pinpointing where to effectively engage with agricultural landowners on the landscape. And in this presentation, we'll walk through these steps of finding indicators of willingness through methods like literature reviews and using those indicators to generate an equation and then placing that equation in space. And while our process focuses on Center County, we offer this process with the hope that practitioners can translate our methods to their own counties across the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed.
So our first step was completing a literature review, and the goal of the literature review was to review existing literature to identify findings and themes that may help to identify which landowner variables or characteristics are important for BMP or riparian buffer adoption. And then the larger scope of this project casts a wide net to get information on landowner values and what types of support are important to them. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will be focusing primarily on demographic information that can be used to inform spatial prioritization of BMP adoption. And so to accomplish this goal, we began by conducting bibliometric analyses, reviewing literature from across disciplines, and finally by identifying key themes across those sources. So for our starting off point, we used a paper published by Armstrong and Stedman in 2012, looking at landowner willingness to implement riparian buffers in the Chesapeake Bay, and specifically in the Spring Creek watershed. And we chose this paper given its relevance to our goal of identifying variables related to landowner willingness to implement buffers. So we completed a bibliometric analysis using this paper to find similar papers based on co-citation coupling and bibliographic coupling, essentially pulling papers with shared citations and references. And as you can see here, the size of each node is relative to the number of citations, and the color of the node refers to the publication year. And from this analysis, we were able to identify 10 prior works, or the 10 papers that were most commonly cited in the network, and 10 derivative works, or the 10 papers that were cited most by other papers in the network, or in other words, the papers with the most connections between nodes. And of these 20 papers, we found 14, which are bolded, that were the most relevant to include in the final literature review. And relevance was determined by the geographic location the paper was focused on, whether it was specific to PA or the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and if it contained useful variables regarding landowner willingness to adopt buffers. So apart from those 14 papers, our team also searched for literature relevant to specific disciplines, such as environmental psychology and sociology and rural sociology, to make sure we weren't missing key literature present in other social sciences. And we identified 13 additional papers by conducting keyword searches in Google Scholar and the Web of Science database. And we started with the most specific search criteria, looking for literature relevant to riparian buffers in central PA from the last 10 years, and then gradually broadened our search to include other areas of the US, and even one paper from Canada to include agricultural BMPs more generally. And we also broadened the timeline to move outside of those 10 years. And within each of these search criteria, we search keywords, which you can see some examples up to the right. And again, as we moved into our findings, I'll be focusing primarily on the demographic information that we found. And so from the literature review, we found 6 key papers on the impact of landowner demographics on BMP adoption. And it's important to note that the 2 of these papers were meta-analyses, meaning that they pulled findings from a large number of studies and then statistically aggregated them to present key takeaways from the literature. So although it's 2 papers, it's representative of many more papers. And so from the literature, some key characteristics emerged. First, whether or not the landowner had previously engaged with riparian buffer outreach programs or part of farming or agricultural organizations. Second, findings suggest that age is only somewhat important in willingness to adopt buffers or BMPs, with one study finding that it only significantly predicted willingness to adopt in 8 of the 32 studies that they had analyzed. And further, there seems to be some conflicting evidence about how age affects willingness to adopt, with one study suggesting that older farmers are less interested in adopting riparian buffers, while a meta-analysis of 46 studies suggests that older farmers are actually more likely to adopt BMPs. And so this conflicting evidence really just suggests taking things with a grain of salt, but it also suggests that older farmers typically are more established, meaning that they may have more resources to adopt than BMPs. So it may be the income that's actually driving the age. And so a third variable, sex, was also looked at in one of the studies and in the first meta-analysis, and the single study found that there was no correlation between sex and adoption of BMPs, whereas the meta-analysis found that sex was significantly associated with BMPs in 19 out of the 32 studies. Although again, this could also be a proxy for resource availability, with male farmers typically having more resources than female farmers. And then the 2 meta-analyses differed in their findings in education, with one saying it was not related to adoption and the other saying it was only related 40% of the time, suggesting that this may not be a relevant factor to look at. So like I mentioned in the beginning, our literature review had a broader scope than just demographics, and in total we analyzed 27 papers to find common themes. Apart from demographics, we also found that landowner values and perceptions of buffers were important, as well as the amount of external support they had in implementing the BMP. And this larger picture suggests that demographics are only a small part of the picture when trying to predict who will be most willing to adopt buffers, and that interaction with local landowners is really important and necessary to evaluate these other more qualitative factors.
So, given this, we still want to be able to use the data that is freely available in order to be able to understand how people are willing to be able to incorporate riparian buffers. Granted, the need to be able to understand the local context is of necessity, but we needed to be able to figure out answers to a variety of questions that will allow for more targeted outreach using freely available data. These questions include what variables are available and are necessary to gather, what resolution of data is necessary to match up with the biophysical data, and what is the nature of the relationship between variables in order to prioritize them for riparian buffer outreach. Understanding these factors, we chose to use demographic data available through the census at the smallest resolution available, called blocks. We chose this data due to it being small enough to further prioritize the parcels outlined by the biophysical data, the data being freely available and therefore being capable of applied in other areas, and the opportunity to replicate once the 2020 census data is released. After consulting on the literature review on the demographic variables available at this scale, we chose the 4 key variables of tenure, sex, age, and population that were deemed necessary to understand the likelihood of riparian buffer adoption based on prior literature. However, we still need to understand the relationship between variables in order to understand the magnitude of impact they will have on buffer adoption. To do so, we use something called an analytical hierarchy process, also known as a rationality test. This rationality test is commonly used to evaluate suitable sites for natural resource management that includes both quantitative factors, in this case, population and age, and qualitative factors, such as sex and tenure. In the rationale test, these variables are weighted against each other based on relative importance informed by experts. So for example, in the rationality test, we need to understand the relative relationship between variables, such as tenure is 9 times more important than age, or tenure is 5 times more important than sex, and so on. Further, we had to figure out how the different categories within each variables relate to each other. For example, some of the variables already had categories, such as tenure and sex, but for others, we had to be able to make categories. For example, categorizing age and population into 4 different variables. Figuring out how this relative importance in the rationality test was difficult. So we had to rely on the previous literature review to determine how variables could be weighted against each other. To determine the correctness or the validity of this equation, a consistency ratio was used to determine the inconsistency in judgment within the analytical hierarchy process. This value must be less than 10%, of which this condition was met within our study. However, it is critical to note that this rationality test is based on the availability of free data and the key variables identified by the literature review, which again was based on Center County. The value of the rationality test and equation used here is that it costs nothing but time to make. But the rationality test can be and should be adapted to your local context based on the factors identified previously in the literature review. Thus, this is simply a first step in figuring out where outreach should occur. Once complete, the outcome of this rationality test is an equation that states the relationship between variables that we used. The equation can then be used to assess each of the blocks within Center County and produce a suitability site score. Or this is the score that represents the likelihood of a landowner to adopt a riparian buffer. However, there is one more additional step. Each block within Center County now has a likelihood of adoption score. That is, it doesn't tell you which ones to target first. Therefore, we decided to further categorize these scores into 5 categories that will tell us approximately the top 20% of blocks representing the highest likelihood of landowners to adopt a buffer. The outcome of this process is the map you see in front of you. Here, the top 20 parcels are the deeply blue shaded blocks that can now be used to further filter parcels to target for a riparian buffer outreach. Now comes the task to be able to relate this material back to the biophysical and consumer data. And for that, I will hand it back over.
So Ryan shared one of our final products with this map, which was this priority map of willingness to adopt riparian buffers in Center County. But remember that we want to bridge the gap in adoption by integrating social and ecological data. So how do we create these integrated maps and how do we use them? Well, we offer a GIS or geospatial pipeline to target priority parcels for riparian buffer outreach by mapping both our equation that Ryan detailed of willingness to adopt and ecological or biophysical need onto the same space. This is a little overwhelming to see as one pipeline all at once, so let's break this down into some more manageable steps. So first, we acquire the geospatial data. Some counties may have census block and parcel data freely available, but we wanted to highlight the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS's Geospatial Data Gateway, which is a really convenient reservoir of resources organized by location. And we can use that resource to find what are called tiger shapefiles at the census block level. This gives us the actual shape of our data in space. Those shapefiles will have an associated unique identifier, which is a string of numbers that condenses all of this spatial information into one value. This GeoID should match exactly with a GeoID from census data, which allows us to join the physical shape of these data in space to their value from the census tables and create the map that Ryan showed. Now we can overlay our sociodemographic map onto maps of high ecological need. And we chose to use the Chesapeake Conservancy's parcel level heat map for precision conservation in Center County. But this same process would work with a heat map created from model data or even ground truth data from windshield surveys, which are likely the most reliable. And we can use this to find intersections of high willingness and high need for riparian buffers. But how do we know that this actually really works? Well, let's zoom in on a case study. This is Beaver Branch, which is a Huck 12 in Spring Creek of Center County. And it's a high priority watershed that was identified by our stakeholders from the local conservation district and a local environmental engineering firm as having a significant contributing area to agriculturally impaired streams. So the outer blue line represents the watershed boundary, cut up with these black lines representing parcels. It's a little hard to see here, but we've overlain in dark blue the census blocks that Ryan's equation says have the people most willing to adopt riparian buffers. Since COVID limited our ability to actually conduct our own outreach to test our equation, we decided to compare our output to the more intensive Metcalfe model that I mentioned in our introduction, where researchers paid around $2,000 to access over 800 variables from consumer data at a parcel level and tested this model with high success. So highlighted in bright blue are the parcels that the Metcalfe model said should be significantly more likely to engage in riparian buffer outreach. So clearly our census block data are at a coarser resolution, so we have some of this background noise. But we captured 80% of the micro-targeted parcels from Metcalfe's model using just 4 sociodemographic variables that are freely accessible to watershed managers and planners anywhere in the country. So we can take an entire Huck 12 and break it down into a few priority parcels. In red are the best opportunities for successful and ecologically impactful engagement, where we have the intersection of high ecological need from Chesapeake Conservancy data and agreement on high likelihood of engagement from both consumer and census data. But additionally, we also have these intersections of consumer and census data, where even if the need for a buffer isn't very high, a landowner might want one anyway. And these potential easy cells are worth targeting because 1, planting any tree is progress, but 2, maybe a more hesitant landowner just needs to see that, hey, my neighbor put in a buffer, it looks really good and he's getting paid for it, maybe I want to learn more too. With that, I'll turn it back over to Ryan to place our research back into the context of moving towards our 2025 goals and beyond.
In conclusion, the point of this research is twofold. First, the outcome of this research is a method to identify areas within your area of interest in the Chesapeake Bay that can be prioritized for buffer outreach. The only cost for this method is time and effort. At no point is the purchase of data necessary for this research. Second, research should be a first step in buffer outreach. This method has little value if it is not coupled with what practitioners do exceptionally well, gaining local knowledge and social connections within the community of interest. As stated earlier, this research was part of a larger project in which interviews were conducted with practitioners in Center County. In essence, what we learned is that if these indicators do not match reality, this tool is of little value. Thus, here are some 3 broad steps to apply this research to your context. First, adapt these indicators to your geographical context. Use the available literature and your on-the-ground knowledge to relate these variables to one another in terms of importance. Second, create your own rationality test to identify key areas of outreach. Continue to draw upon your local knowledge bases, your practitioners, to adapt this equation. Then visualize this data by mapping. Finally, use your local knowledge, AKA your team and your local landowners, to assess the accuracy of this tool in order to be able to use this within your own local context. With that, we'd like to acknowledge our co-authors, stakeholders, training grants, and all others without whom this project would not be possible. In particular, we'd like to highlight a pre-recorded forum session available by Allison Olsch and Aaron Letavik, which talks more about how this collaboration was made possible.